Well, just hours ago, the state of Alabama executed the man convicted of a brutal 1993 murder. Anthony Boyd was executed by nitrogen gas today around 6:30 this evening. A judge sentenced him for the murder of Gregory Huguley in Talladega. Prosecutors say Boyd taped Huguley's feet together before another man doused him with gasoline and set him on fire over a $200 cocaine debt. What you're seeing and hearing is a rally that happened yesterday where people marched to stop his execution. Before his execution window opened, Boyd left a message with the Execution Intervention Project discussing the state of Alabama and the death penalty. Here's a listen.
They deserve better in this state. They deserve better representation. They deserve better leadership. They deserve better means and opportunities. They need progressive in this state. This state has so much to offer, but they're being held back so far.
A new documentary called The Alabama Solution is shining a spotlight on the conditions inside Alabama's state prisons. A legislative hearing at the state's capitol yesterday was packed as families and ministers described inmates being beaten, extorted, and intimidated and forced to sleep on floors. Nearly 5 years after the Justice Department sued Alabama over cruel and unusual punishment, state prisons have reported 1,600 assaults so far this year. The documentary details cases like a corrections officer who was promoted to lieutenant after allegedly beating an inmate to death. Corrections Commissioner John Hamm acknowledges a cultural problem exists, but says fixing it will take time.
Every case cuts deep. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and step with me into the dark.
The room was silent, except for the low hum of machinery, the kind of sound that fills space without offering comfort. In a prison in southern Alabama, decades after a single summer afternoon unraveled into violence, Anthony Todd Boyd faced the final consequence of a story that had begun long before death row, before appeals, before debates about justice and mercy. By the time the state prepared to carry out his execution, the questions surrounding his case had hardened into something immovable. How much responsibility belongs to one man, how much to a moment, and how much to a system that cannot rewind time once it has moved too far forward? To understand how it reached that point, you have to leave the present behind and step back into Talladega County in the summer of 1993. It was hot in the way only Alabama heat can be, heavy and unrelenting, pressing down on people until tempers thinned and patience wore out. This was a place where everyone seemed connected by a few degrees of separation, where rumors traveled fast and debts, especially drug debts, carried real weight. In that environment, small disputes had a way of growing teeth. Anthony Boyd was in his early 20s then, moving through a circle of acquaintances tied together by drugs, money, and fragile loyalties. Among them was Gregory Huguley, a man who owed a relatively small amount of money by most standards, but in that world, $200 was not insignificant. It represented disrespect, broken trust, and a challenge that some believed could not be ignored without consequence. As the day unfolded, frustration simmered. Phone calls were made, voices sharpened. What might have remained an argument instead began to feel like a problem that needed solving. That afternoon, the tension reached a point where talk turned into action. Several men gathered, their shared purpose forming quickly, almost casually, as if once the idea existed, it could not be put back where it came from. They believed Huguley needed to be found, confronted, and forced to make things right. Whether anyone paused to consider where that path could lead is unclear. What is clear is that restraint slipped away, replaced by momentum. Huguley was located and taken against his will. The line between intimidation and kidnapping blurred, then disappeared altogether. He was bound, restrained, and moved, his fear growing as options closed around him. In moments like these, responsibility fragments. Each participant can later point to another decision-maker, another voice, another hand. But in real time, the group moved together, feeding off shared resolve and escalating pressure. As evening approached, the situation grew darker. The effort to recover a debt transformed into something more ominous. Gasoline was introduced, an unmistakable signal that the stakes had changed. The smell alone would have made the danger impossible to ignore. This was no longer about money. It was about control, punishment, and the kind of power that once tasted is difficult to release. Somewhere in that sequence of events, the point of no return was crossed. Gregory Huguley was taken to a remote area, isolated enough that screams would carry nowhere and mercy would find no easy entry. The choices being made were no longer reversible. Even if doubt surfaced, even if fear crept in, the machinery of the moment kept moving forward, driven by anger, pride, and the unspoken understanding that stopping now would mean facing what had already been done. This is where the story tightens, where every later courtroom argument and appeal traces back to a narrowing window of time. The men involved stood at the edge of an act that would define their lives, whether they fully grasped it or not. For Huguley, there was only the terror of what was coming. For Boyd and the others, there was the weight of decisions that would soon be sealed into evidence, testimony, and memory. As night settled over Talladega County, the crime was no longer a possibility. It was unfolding, and once it did, there would be no version of the future untouched by what happened next. The echoes of that evening would stretch across decades, through prison corridors and legal briefs, into the quiet moment when the state would finally say the account was closed. If you stay with this story, not just to learn what happened, but to sit with the unanswered questions it leaves behind, the next part traces how those choices became a case, how truth and testimony collided, and how the justice system attempted to make sense of something that could never truly be undone. The night did not end when the fire went out. What followed was a long, stunned quiet, broken only by the realization that Gregory Huguley was gone, and nothing could be taken back. His body was left behind in a remote area of Talladega County, the aftermath of violence, bearing witness to decisions made in haste and anger. By morning, the space where the crime occurred had become something else entirely. No longer a hidden place, but the beginning of an investigation that would pull many lives into its gravity. Huguley's death was discovered, and law enforcement moved quickly, confronting a scene that offered both answers and questions. The condition of the body made clear that this was not an accident. Evidence pointed to restraint, to fire, to a deliberate act carried out by more than one person. Investigators began retracing Huguley's last known movements, mapping phone calls, conversations, and conflicts. The unpaid drug debt surfaced almost immediately, providing a motive that fit the brutality of what had occurred. Attention turned to the circle of men Huguley had been with in the hours before his death. Interviews followed, some cooperative, others guarded. Stories shifted as pressure increased. Details emerged in fragments, each statement revealing a little more, while also attempting to deflect blame. In cases like this, truth rarely arrives whole. It is assembled piece by piece, often through contradiction. Anthony Boyd became one of the central figures in the investigation. Prosecutors alleged that he played a significant role in the kidnapping and murder, a claim Boyd would later deny. Forensic findings confirmed the cause of death and supported the timeline described by witnesses. Physical evidence aligned with accounts of restraint and burning, reinforcing the state's theory of the case. As arrests were made, the legal process began its slow, grinding work. At trial, the story of that summer night was reconstructed in a courtroom far removed from the heat and chaos in which it began. Jurors listened as prosecutors described a coordinated act driven by retaliation and control. Defense attorneys challenged the reliability of witnesses, many of whom had their own charges or incentives. Boyd maintained that he was not responsible for Huguley's death, asserting that he was not present at the critical moments. The jury was left to weigh conflicting narratives against the evidence placed before them. The verdict came in 1995. Anthony Boyd was convicted of capital murder during a kidnapping. The jury recommended death by a vote that was not unanimous, a detail that would later become part of broader legal debate. The judge imposed a death sentence, and Boyd was sent to death row. Other participants in the crime received different sentences, some serving long prison terms, others eventually returning to the world outside. The contrast would linger, raising questions that courts do not always answer. Years turned into decades as Boyd pursued appeals through state and federal courts. His attorneys argued trial errors, questioned witness credibility, and raised concerns about the fairness of his conviction. He continued to assert his innocence. Each appeal was reviewed, considered, and ultimately denied. Meanwhile, the legal landscape around capital punishment shifted, but not in ways that altered Boyd's fate. As time passed, the case became part of a larger national conversation about the death penalty and execution methods. Alabama adopted nitrogen hypoxia, a method intended to cause death by depriving the body of oxygen. Boyd challenged its use, arguing that it was unconstitutional. Courts rejected those claims as well. The focus narrowed from guilt and innocence to procedure and protocol, the final stages of a long legal journey. In October 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Anthony Boyd was executed at Holman Correctional Facility. In his final moments, he maintained that he did not kill Gregory Huguley. Outside the prison walls, the execution marked the end of the state's case, but not the end of the questions surrounding it. For Huguley's family, the loss had already stretched across a lifetime, shaped by grief rather than legal timelines. For Boyd's family, the execution closed one chapter while leaving another permanently unresolved. For the community, the case remained a reminder of how quickly a small conflict can spiral into irreversible harm. This story ends where it began, with consequences that cannot be undone and answers that never fully satisfy. As you sit with it, consider not just what the law decided, but what remains unsettled in its wake. Some stories do not ask us to judge, only to remember, and to keep listening when the silence feels too easy.